Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as always, it's an honor to be able to rise in this place and to talk about issues that are so important to my constituents and all Canadians, and particularly on Bill S-209. I find it interesting that we are debating the creation of a day, which is approximately 4 years ago, when COVID-19 became a big thing. And that 4 years ago, I remember it well. I was in this place as a newly elected member of Parliament, and it was a chaotic time. Many people didn't know what was going on. We had differing intelligence. We had news. In fact, it wasn't even called COVID at that time. And then it was declared a pandemic, and then this place and basically the country was shut down. But then now, Mr. Speaker, 4 years later, we have an attempt to memorialize this in the context of a day of recognition. But Mr. Speaker, what I think is interesting, and I would suggest very troubling, is that we have a effort by a member of the Liberal Party to bring forward this Pandemic Day Act, sponsored on our side in the House of Commons, put forward by a senator. But what I think needs to be said very, very clearly is how impactful COVID was, and not just the virus that had unquestionably a significant impact on so many lives. But Mr. Speaker, as I've reflected back, and because the debate of this bill was bumped back a couple of weeks, I've had additional time to consider it. What I find very troubling is, as I look back, how the mismanagement, the efforts of the Liberals the Liberals in particular, to squash and disregard the rights and freedoms of Canadians, the division that took place. I think of the 2021 election. In fact, I was reflecting on this the other day, how unbelievably divisive that election was, when literally in this place, 2 months before the Prime Minister went to Rideau Hall to call an election, he promised that he wouldn't, and used vaccinations, something again he promised that he would never force Canadians to get vaccinated, and then he used that as a political weapon to divide Canadians against each other, splitting families apart, churches, organizations, communities, and for what? The purposes and pursuit of power. Mr. Speaker, I reflect back upon the early days of the pandemic, when it was the actions of this place were shut down, and there was I would suggest cross-partisan collaboration, a willingness to say, okay, we don't know what's going on. We certainly can't trust what's coming out of China. There was questions about what the WHO was saying, and we had to figure things out. But what did the Liberals do? Instead of being willing to work together, they would claim on television that a Team Canada approach is needed, which is simply code for they failed, which we've learned time and time again since that point. But, Mr. Speaker, what we saw is that it wasn't a willingness to collaborate. They wanted unlimited taxation and spending authority for a year and a half, something that would have defied 800 years of Westminster democratic tradition. Like, look, you look time and time again throughout the tumult of COVID-19 and the pandemic. There was certainly significant challenges, and we saw our healthcare system put under tremendous strain, which, Mr. Speaker, it was unfortunate that we didn't, and that the result of that wasn't a realistic conversation about the fact that we had a virus that brought our healthcare system to its knees, even though we invest hundreds of billions of dollars a year into that healthcare system. We have not had those realistic conversations in the follow-up to that. We see so often, and I was speaking to someone earlier today who talked about the trauma that they and members of their family, talking about how a member of their family committed suicide because of the isolation that they faced during COVID. We see tragic stories like that. And then now we still have the concerns, whether that's some concerns around vaccine injuries, which the Liberals seem quick to suggest is simply conspiratorial. And then you have concerns related to long COVID, where there are individuals that still cannot get access to the care that they need to deal with some consequences of a virus that we still don't necessarily have a good understanding of. And I would just note a practical impact of the mismanagement is that there used to be a pretty significant consensus. And I've been very vocal in my support for the use of vaccines. And this dates to long before COVID. But Mr. Speaker, because of the Liberals' intentional dividing of Canadians, we see that there is greater vaccine hesitancy today than there was only a few years ago. And then, of course, we saw, and I happen to be on the Ethics Committee, of which I have the opportunity to serve in this Parliament as well, but we saw that when there was dollars expended, when Liberals spend money, along with that money comes scandal. Whether it was We Charity, ventilators, Arrive scam, on and on and on the scandal train goes. We see how it was things that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago have been normalized because of the willingness of the government to take advantage. And they even use language like this. They used it in terms of trying to reshape the economy to some utopian vision that certainly is not leaving Canadians better off. So it's the furthest thing from a utopia, but that's the language to which they use. So Mr. Speaker, in the few minutes that I have left, I would simply suggest this. There are still many Canadians that want answers about the spending, want answers about the actions, want answers about why things were allowed to devolve, and how so often still today we hear it, how COVID is still used as simply as an excuse, whether that be for the debt and deficits. Yet we learned of the COVID spending. There was 35% of money that was expended during COVID was not even related to the pandemic. And we see just a mismanagement, and I would share this with you, Mr. Speaker. And it's when it comes to the national response, especially in the early days of the pandemic, the economic inefficiencies to which the government managed programs is astounding. They were unwilling to work with industry, but instead they would both encourage sectors of the economy to lay people off, to which they would subsidize them being laid off, and then they would subsidize those businesses to continue to keep their doors open. Talk about inefficiencies, and no wonder we have such a productivity gap that is existing today. So, Mr. Speaker, 4 years ago, I believe it was March 11th, and I remember that briefing that took place, and the irony, it was interesting because you had a couple hundred people packed into a committee room that had been set up in a theater style in the Wellington building, where you had health officials that basically said, we don't know what's going on. But you see how in times of crisis, the virtue of leadership shows up. And in that regard, Canada was left lacking. We saw, instead of bringing a country together, we saw a Prime Minister that attempted to enrich himself and his friends. We saw a government that, instead of trying to collaborate, tried to consolidate and bring forward more authority upon themselves. So do we need a day to acknowledge the trauma that so many are faced? And I still hear from people that that have had broken relationships, broken family members, loss of loved ones, on all sides of each debate, whether it's for vaccines, against vaccines, for lockdowns, against lockdowns, whether it be for support for action on COVID, taking it seriously, and those who don't. The trauma that was unleashed upon our country because we had a government that was more worried about self-preservation than working in the best interests of Canadians, I think is a legacy that certainly bears reflection, but I certainly don't think the way to do that is in a day of recognition, because on the division, I think Canadians would far rather see accountability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.